I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about how I ended up doing this, who writes the stories, what we write about, and I can't read my own notes. And if I've got enough time, I'll finish a little bit about what comes next. Over the last few years, I've become very unhappy about the rise of extremism, about fascists and racists wearing the guise of patriotism and acting like bastards. Now they're outside Parliament fighting and intimidating police and public alike about the policy of government and society and picking on the poor, the helpless and the marginalised. We seem to have become a society that stopped caring. I'm also disgusted by the behaviour of our politicians, who I feel have let the people down badly. They make things worse for everyone but themselves. As I entered my 50s, I became a little bit more belligerent. At the age of 52, I went on my first protest march. It was for science, a march for science. I'm not trying to be funny here, but you shouldn't have to go on a march for facts. That notwithstanding, I felt that constantly moaning about things was a poor excuse. So in answer to the obvious asked question, what are you going to do about it? The answer was, start a satirical online newspaper. To be fair, wasn't the answer I was expecting. Anyone permanently connected to the internet will have seen many, many funny and satirical stories come their way. Maybe it was a forwarded email or a link or a post on Twitter, Facebook and so on. There are a variety of sites doing this kind of stuff with varying degrees of success. The Private Eye, the Daily Mash, the Daily Mail, News Thump, the Onion, the Rochdale Herald. There are loads of them. You just got the Daily Mail one, didn't you? I used to sit there, usually on the toilet, desperately trying to put off going back to work, and I'd read these little stories. After a while, I began to wonder if I could write something. And then I wondered if I could write it and get it published. Turned out I could. Sorry, this is the first story I ever had published, and it was in the Rochdale Herald. And this was written when the Cambridge Analytical scandal was breaking. Amongst other things, they were accused of rigging Brexit and manipulating votes in the general election. In the end, the company was forced to close. This story was a play on that, and it concerned the manipulation of the very lucrative Northern Pie market and the fixing of the price of a Greggs steak bake. It's currently trading at £1.75, but it's a very volatile market. That wasn't what you were expecting, was it? So I carried on writing for the Rochdale Herald. They enrolled me in their writers group, they gave me feedback, they published my stories, and it was fun. Towards the end of last summer, I started wondering if I could build and run my own online satirical newspaper. Turns out I could. This is the first story I published of the Chatty Chimp. It was inspired by a trip to the Edinburgh Festival using EasyJet. We were stuck in a queue at the boarding gate whilst one of their harassed staff patiently explained to a lady that one bag meant one bloody bag, and yes, that did include a fucking handbag. That's what one bag means. Once I'd published one story, I was off.
Harsh.
Harsh. You've been in an EasyJet queue. So the next job was to get some writers. This is my motley crew. They all have one thing in common, a desire to anonymously write silly stories about life for no pay. They're a mixed bag. They're mostly unpublished amateurs. There are a couple of professionals in there. One of them is an internationally award-winning playwright. So far, all of our authors have chosen to remain anonymous. It's not compulsory, but it does give them a licence to say what they like. Unless they provide a picture, I try to choose something that reflects what little I know about them. Sometimes that's not very much. Yes, that bottom left is the picture of a sheep. That's Alan Shearer, our sports correspondent. It's just wrong. It's just what he wanted, but it's a horrible name. As the number of writers built up, we started working out what worked, what didn't. We gave feedback, and we're a lot better at stories now than we were when we started. We've also started to learn how to edit stories, and that is a skill and a half and takes more than a year to learn. So now we have a website and some writers. We're off and running. What are we going to write about? As you can't see from this list of cute stories, anything really. Politics, life, the arts, politics, sports, money, relationships, politics. Anything we can think of in 200 to 250 words. There's very little that is taboo. On this list we have stories about religion, Mother's Day, football, drug dealing and a little bit of politics. We've also learned to muddle through libel laws and the intricacies of image rights. We do find it difficult when stories in real life are a little bit more difficult. They outdo what we can make up. For example, the pilot who sued his airline for unfair dismissal after he developed a fear of flying. Laughing. The company gave him every help. They gave him time off, counselling and shorter routes. After that, he still couldn't fly planes. They offered him a ground position for lower money. He said no and went to an industrial tribunal. He won. That's the headline from The Independent, to prove that I'm not making that up. It is, isn't it? We'll come back to that theme again. Sometimes a headline is so outrageous that it's not even worth us bothering with. As this piece in The Independent reads. Just read the headline at the top.
Can you read it out?
Theresa May planned to defeat herself, then decided not to defeat herself by defeating herself, then lost to herself.
No. John Craves.
That's where we are.
That's pretty much it. That was Theresa Vote 2. There's nothing to do with that. It's in every newspaper. There's nothing we can write that's going to add anything to that one. Sometimes we manage to get stories up as they happen. This is one of them. This was an earthquake in Surrey. It's a nice story because the earthquakes are rarely an issue in the UK. We were able to combine this with the perception that people in Surrey are preoccupied with the value of their houses, especially in relation to their oversized mortgages. Some of our writers, including the writer of this one, have their own pet subjects, things that they're really keen on, things that get them fired up. In Colin's case, American gun culture is one of these things. As we all know, America kills more of its citizens with guns than any other country not in a state of war. What upsets Colin about this is the automatic response of the National Rifle Association, the Republican Party, Donald Trump and Charlton Heston to these mass shootings. So he came up with this handy template. His point is that sending thoughts and prayers is meaningless. It's trotted out every time there's a shooting, hence the template. The alterable fields relate to the location, the numbers and the appropriate comment from the local sheriff, Billy Bob, whatever his name is. We run this periodically. There's always another shooting. It's clear that in the UK we don't understand American gun culture. We find it appalling, and more so because it so often involves children. Whilst there may be taste issues with the piece, it is effective in making the point that nothing is changing. Being fans of doing as little work as possible, we were delighted to take the template idea and use it the next time an MP was caught out doing something naughty. And just as luck would have it, along came Boris Johnson. I particularly like the paragraph that reads, "I'd like to offer a full and insincere apology to my wife, my constituents, the British people, the House of Commons, my wife again, my employer, my friends' husbands, the wife's friends' husbands, and finally my wife." The great thing about politicians is that in satirical terms they tend to be the gift that keeps on giving. And one that stood out to us was Chris Grayling. As you can't see from this one, we've run several stories featuring him. This is a list of them. So this includes Chris Grayling seems unsure what a queue of lorries looks like, so we provided a picture to help. P&O relocate to Cyprus after finding out Chris Grayling will be in charge of cross-channel ferry services. And Seabourn Freight win Outstanding Ferry Company of the Year. It wasn't just the chronic ineptitude that got to us, it was the brazen way he tried to justify it. This is a man who, as prison minister, wanted to ban books being sent to prisoners. He oversaw huge cuts to the police and judicial services, including the legal aid budget and the court booking system. His reforms of the probation services were cited by the Audit Commission as not fit for purpose and had resulted in a £500 million overspend. Labour calculated the cost of all his cock-ups at over £2 billion. However, what is interesting is the main reason he caught our eye. We would have accepted his awarding of an emergency ferry supply contract to a company with no boats as a standard government balls-up, had he not publicly come out to defend it and to imply that Cathy Newman, a very respected journalist, was some kind of traitor for tackling him on the issue. He brazenly claimed to have done due diligence on the company. It's worth looking up the interview online, it's priceless. He said he wasn't going to apologise for supporting a British company. Cathy asked him how you could do due diligence on a company that had no boats, hadn't traded, had no staff. And his response was, "It's a British company, rah, rah, rah." Unfortunately for Chris, he did this interview 2 days before it transpired that Seabourn Freight's terms and conditions were from an online pizza delivery company, that they had no contract with Ramsgate, and one director had been involved with the ferry company, but that had gone bust and owed the taxman £1.6 million. As that wasn't enough, he then had to pay Eurotunnel £33 million. The figure would have been a lot less, but it included a keep everything secret clause. This is genuinely true. He also negotiated a contract with the other ferry operators worth £40 million that resulted in them running empty ferries from the 29th of March. He went on the record in the House of Commons saying that his actions were prudent and justified under the circumstances. We took the view that the circumstances he was operating under was that he was an incompetent bellend. Sometimes writing satire is hard when you're up against the experts. We always look for different ways to try and take the mickey and poke fun out of those who've drawn themselves to our attention for unfavourable behaviour. So we came up with the idea of doing obituaries for those who had, for one reason or another, not yet died. Superbly tasteless. We mess about with the names just for fun. For example, we have Dr. Flying Fox, Haiti Hopkins, Aaron Banksett, Mears Morgan, and the upholder of Victorian moral values, Sir Christopher Chode. There's a footnote that goes with that story explaining what a chode is. You can look it up, but it's a little rude. Incidentally, the Flying Fox things is to get around the libel laws. We wanted to go with Lying Fox, but it was why he was sacked as Defence Minister, but it was a bit too near the knuckle. Fortunately, the story about his and his team's air miles was around. He knocked up 219,000 air miles in 18 months. A bit of alliteration did the rest. Another fella who attracted our attention was a young chap called Tommy Robinson. He's a particularly nasty little shite. With a string of convictions for assault, fighting, false identity and mortgage fraud, the founder of EDL and other racist organisations has set out to represent himself as a martyr, a fighter for freedom and a victim of the establishment that can't handle the truth. His actions in disrupting sexual abuse trials are particularly nasty. Giving evidence in a sexual abuse trial is a horrendous experience, particularly for the victims. Well, especially for the victims. Intentionally causing a mistrial and putting victims through that ordeal again, he thoroughly deserves our condemnation. This bit that you also can't read is from the contempt of court case at Canterbury Court, where he was sentenced. He was given a suspended sentence, and the judge says, "In short, Mr. Yaxley Lennon turn up at another court and refer to people as Muslim paedophiles, Muslim rapists, and so on, whilst trials are ongoing, and before there has been a finding by a jury that that is what they are, you will find yourself inside. Do you understand?" What he did? When he did it again. Watch out for Tommy Robinson playing the martyr on BBC News Bulletin somewhere near you. It's also worth noting that he was convicted of mortgage fraud. In unrelated news, he's just bought himself a £1 million mansion in Berkshire. Like I say, these people are experts. Someone once asked me what makes Chatty Chimp unique. My response is that we're mainly written by people with little or no writing or journalistic experience. This fine-looking filly is Lady Tamsin Marie. She responded to one of our articles looking for people to send stuff in. She'd no previous writing experience but was keen to have a go. New writers are great. They're full of enthusiasm, happy to take feedback, glad to see their names in print, and most of all, they're cheap. This is a good thing because we've got no money to pay them. What is nice is working with people and giving them a chance to find out how funny they can be. Like many writers, me included, when we start writing these little satires, we get them the wrong way round. Here's an example. Most writers start with stories that are too long, fit too many disparate elements, and are weighted too much towards the end of the story. This seems a logical approach. The trouble is it doesn't work for these types of stories. This weight problem in men's story follows that pattern. You can immediately see, just from the layout, that it's too long. It's a good story, and it was written by a professional writer. You have to think about how people read these type of stories. Usually it's whilst they're on doing something else, they're reading them on the mobile or a tablet. So they read the headline, scan the article to get to the gag and flick through to the end. I'm tempted to just put absolute gobbledygook into the final paragraph just to test this out. Anyhow, Tamsin followed the same path. We gave her some feedback, she persisted, and we started publishing her stories. Most of the stories she started with were political in one way or another, and very heavily Theresa May featured. So on this list that you also can't read, we have Mother Theresa May continues to pray for a miracle as the devil tests the Brexit faithful. And PM Furious has plot to leak the Brexit timetable foiled after leaked notes detailing the planned leak are leaked. Over time, as we work together, her stories have shifted away from the political and more to lifestyle. She now writes more about relationships, children and boorish behaviour. So on this list we have things like consternation in the classroom as a child completes their half-term project unaided. Some parents in the room, I feel.
Teacher parents.
And after a northern... It's even worse. After a northerner slags off Borough Market, the locals suggest he sticks to Wetherspoons. One of my favourite Lady Tamsin stories is about the encouragement women receive from men whilst out jogging. Sometimes inspiration comes from a variety of sources. In this case, it was listening to someone called Tim give a talk about going to a Zen Buddhist retreat in Spain. I sat there wondering about how I might find out about what I might find out about myself if I did that. This is the result. To be fair, when I wrote this, it's about the 5th version. So we're always looking for ways. We're always looking to develop our stories, and one of the things we're playing around with is explaining the origin of a story. So at the bottom we add a bit in which explains why we wrote the story, what it was relevant, and we link it to various news articles of the original story. This came out of search engine optimization, which is a fancy name for trying to get Google to rank your story ahead of someone else. It tries to mimic the search algorithm, and it's amazing how much detail it goes into. Readability, individual words, length, internal and external links, and all count. It's a tool all on its own. Our ideal story is 200 to 250 words, which is less than the minimum. This extra section helps us get there. Really, we just want to see if people like this feature. If we don't, we'll end up dropping it. We've also been playing with memes on social media. This was from the Leavers March, a colossal cock-up organised by Nigel Farage. It was planned for 2 weeks. They were going to march to London. He charged everyone £50 to go on it. He turned up for 2 hours on day one, then disappeared. We sent out this appeal on social media just in case he was in any danger. And this one, well, this was just too good to resist. We like the play on words with a double meaning. I now realise that when we posted that on social media, we put his name in the post. That's Chris Grayling. Hence the gaffer. Anyway, if you feel inspired to pick up a pen, write a silly story and send it in to submissions@chattychimp.co, we would love to hear from you.